Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff coming to you from Ra'anana outside of Tel Aviv. This is episode 95 of the podcast. The title is Lone Soldier Need to Know. I'm going to give you a bunch of need to know ideas and background info about lone soldiers in the IDF in preparation for my conversation next week with the mother of Michael Levin, Zichrono Livracha, Harriet Levin. And I'll get to that in a moment. But first, I do want to bring you up to date on what's happening in Israel right now. It is the week of August 20th, 2025. And today was a general strike in Israel. Now, this was not an official strike. An official strike would need to be declared by the Histadrut, which is the labor union. But this was a grassroots effort strike led by the Hostage Family Forum, and then a lot of other businesses and, of course, individuals got on board. And the idea behind the strike today in Israel was to shut down the country economically. There's this feeling that the government really doesn't care what the majority of the population believes. And as much as I try to stay apolitical in this podcast, sometimes it's hard not to sound political, but here I'm just telling you the facts, although it's going to come across sounding political. The fact is, we're now at about 75% of the Israeli population who wants the war to end so that we can bring the hostages home, even if that means withdrawing the IDF from Gaza. Actually, I would say especially if that means withdrawing the IDF from Gaza, because the plan right now is to conquer Gaza City. And that really threatens the hostages who we have a feeling are being held in Gaza City. So the chance that we'd get any of the hostages alive at this point, really that hope is diminishing if we do attempt to conquer Gaza City. And there's the very likely possibility of a massive number of IDF casualties, of injured and dead Israeli soldiers. I've heard estimates anywhere from 200 to 1,000 as the estimate of the number of IDF soldiers who could be killed. That's not injured. That could be killed if we truly attempt to conquer Gaza City. And that's an anecdotal number that I heard from someone in the know. But nevertheless, that is a high, high number. And that's what the population of Israel, the 75% who want the war to end, that is what they are against. They're not against the idea of Israel as a country, as some of the members of the Knesset who are on the right are saying that the protesters are. They are trying to protect the lives of soldiers and trying to protect the lives of hostages. And at this point, the feeling is that the government simply is ignoring the will of the population, and that the only way to get the government to respond to what the people want is to shut down, to crash the country economically by closing businesses, closing the airport, closing stores. And so we have this mass strike today where a lot of businesses are closed, but not all. And the high tech community joined on. So most high tech companies shut down for the day and gave their employees not just permission, but encouraged them to protest. We're expecting that 1 million people, 1 million Israelis, will pass through Kikar Hatufim, Hostage Square, at some point today. Some of it, many of them at their mass rally scheduled for 8 p.m. tonight, but others just throughout the day. We've had speakers in Hostage Square in the middle of Tel Aviv throughout the day. And the total that we're expecting is 1 million people. The highways were shut down today. People were literally sitting cross-legged in the middle of the highways, the major highways here in Israel, blocking traffic in both directions. Water cannons were used to clear protesters from one of the highways outside of Jerusalem. Last number I heard is that 30 people have been arrested. And as I mentioned, many of the right-wing members of the Knesset are calling the protesters traitors and saying that they are emboldening Hamas and strengthening the enemy. So that's the situation in Israel right now. This massive day, this shvita, as we say in Hebrew, a strike, a general strike, though again, not an official one. And one little twist is that around 4 p.m. here in Israel, the sirens went off. Apparently, there was a missile attack from Yemen. And I just want to make clear, and I've said this before, that I am not a conspiracy theory guy. I've said this multiple times on the podcast that I don't tend to believe in conspiracy theories, mostly because human beings are horrible at keeping secrets. And for a conspiracy theory to work, you need many, many people to share a secret and no one to fess up and open their mouths. And that's just hard for a human being to do. But I do want to report to you what a lot of Israelis are saying. And a lot of Israelis are saying that this missile attack by Yemen at 4 in the afternoon, there are a number of Israelis, some in journalistic circles, respected journalistic circles, who are saying that this was actually not a real missile attack, that it was the Israeli government who was sounding the sirens to cause panic against the protesters who are taking to the streets against the government right now. There are others who are saying actually it was an actual missile attack from Yemen, but the timing is fishy. Last night, Israel attacked one of the major ports in Yemen. That I might need to be corrected. Maybe it was one of the major electrical plants. I believe that. I believe it was one of the major electrical plants in Yemen, power plants. And that timing seems a little fishy to a lot of Israelis, that the night before this general strike, Israel would attack Yemen, knowing that a response would come the next day while protesters are out in the streets. Again, I'm not saying that this is what I believe, but I am saying that it's important for you to know that this is where Israelis are right now. Many Israelis are at the point that even when the sirens go off, they are wondering if it's their own government who is sounding a false alarm merely to threaten them. That's how far things have come. And I've talked before about civil war and the possibility of civil war here in Israel. And I've said civil war is not going to look like the Blues against the Grays, the way it was in the late 1800s when America experienced its civil war. It's not going to be that bolet, that clear. It's going to be when people really mistrust the government and really mistrust each other and start blaming other groups within Israel for the country's problems. And that's already happening. And this idea that Israelis are questioning their own government and whether their own government would play a trick on them simply as an act of revenge against the protesters, that shows you where Israel is at right now and just how far we've come and how badly this country is in need of healing. So that's the situation from Israel right now. In a minute, I'll be back with the main story of today's episode, which is Lone Soldier Need to Know. Welcome back to Inside Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff again from Ra'anana this week, and today's title is Lone Soldier Need to Know. And the idea of today's episode is to give you a little preface. Today's episode is a preface to an interview I'm running next week. This August marks the 19th Yortzeit of Michael Levin, Zichrono Livracha. Michael Levin was a paratrooper from the Philadelphia area, Langhorne, Pennsylvania. Grew up in the conservative movement in the U.S., went to Camp Ramah, did the Nativ gap year program after high school, and then decided to join the IDF and became a paratrooper. And he was killed in the 2006 Lebanon War, which Israelis refer to as Lebanon Shtaim, the second Lebanon War, the first one being in 1982, lasted for 18 years until 2000. And then in 2006, we fought Hezbollah once again in Lebanon. And Michael Levin was killed in that war in the summer of 2006, 19 years ago this August. And since then, his parents, Harriet and Mark, have become close friends of mine. And I've followed closely the work that they do. And I do fundraising once in a while on behalf of them. This fall, I'm doing a little comedy tour where we're raising money for the Lone Soldier, Michael Levin's Lone Soldier Foundation, which they run and which helps lone soldiers here in Israel. And I recently sat down. I was down in Florida and I sat down with Harriet and had a conversation with her about Michael's life, about the state of lone soldiers right now, about the idea of fate and whether this was Michael's purpose. I know that's hard to imagine, and it was hard to ask her this question, but I did ask her, is it possible that Michael's purpose was to die young in battle as a way to inspire so many lone soldiers behind him and also inspire the entire Israeli population? And before we run that interview next week, I think there are a few things that you need to know, or I want you to know, about lone soldiers here in Israel, just so you can be prepared for everything that Harriet and I are going to talk about. And why is she down in Florida? Because she and Mark, they're snowbirds. They're at that point. They have a place down in the Fort Lauderdale area in the wintertime, and that's when I was there. I was there, I guess it was in February that I interviewed her. And summers, they're back in Langhorne, Pennsylvania. So here's some things I just want you to know about the lone soldier situation in Israel right now. Today, there are more than 7,000 lone soldiers in the IDF. And let's compare that to the number of lone soldiers there were back when I was in the Israeli army in 1997 and 1998. Back then, there were only a few hundred of us, maybe 200, maybe 300. No one even really knew. And that's part of what Michael's death did, is open the eyes of the Israeli population to what lone soldiers are and who we are and why we come. The lone soldiers in the IDF, I've mentioned there are more than 7,000. They come from 80 countries. And you can imagine some of the countries they come from: the US, Canada, the UK, Australia. But they also come from countries you would never, certainly I would never imagine, like Denmark and Sweden and Japan and Mexico and Uruguay. So there are 7,000 lone soldiers from 80 countries around the world. Now, what a lot of people don't realize, and I actually didn't know this until I began researching my most recent book, Israel 201. I have a chapter on lone soldiers, is that that number, 7,000 lone soldiers, it's a little bit misleading, because what it makes you think is that all of them are from these 80 countries around the world. But it turns out that half of all lone soldiers, about 3,500 of the lone soldiers in Israel right now, are from Israel. They were born and raised here, but they simply have no relationship with their parents anymore for various reasons. Some of them are orphans. Parents have died, and so they are alone. And when they are drafted, they are treated like lone soldiers because they don't have parents to take care of them. But the majority of these Israeli born lone soldiers are actually disowned. They are disowned by their families. Many of them are from the Haredi ultra Orthodox community, and they choose to serve despite the fact that most ultra Orthodox Israelis do not serve in the army. They choose to serve anyway. And so their parents disown them and they say, "You serve in the IDF, you are no longer a part of this family." And they kick them out of the house. And so they are technically lone soldiers. And this is probably a good time to mention that the term lone soldier, Chayel Boded, it's a legal term. To be considered a lone soldier in Israel, it means that you have neither parent living in Israel during the time of your service. So back when I was in the IDF, my parents both lived in Chicago, so I was a lone soldier. But these Israeli lone soldiers, they're also considered lone soldiers because even though their parents may be alive here in Israel, they don't have a relationship with them. A lot of them are from the LGBTQ community, and a segment of those are from the LGBTQ ultra Orthodox Haredi community. And so they don't have relationships with their parents. They are kicked out of their homes. Some of them, their parents are criminals or alcoholics or drug users. And they just simply don't have a home anymore. They live on the streets. And so the army takes them in, not just in order to make them soldiers, but they take them in as a way to give them a stepping stone into Israeli society. And That's really important for you to know as we talk about the lone soldier movement and the work of Harriet and Mark Levin on behalf of Michael and Michael's memory, is that the Lone Soldier Foundation does not only help the foreign born lone soldiers, guys like me, they also help the Israeli born lone soldiers. They have a whole sector of the foundation that's dedicated to helping these Israeli kids acclimate into society, survive in the army. There have been stories of these Israeli born lone soldiers on the weekends when their friends would go home for Shabbat. They would go to an abandoned storefront and just sleep, inside an abandoned store or in an abandoned warehouse, or would squat in some other, under bridges or other undesirable locations throughout the country. So this is a real phenomenon too, the Israeli-born lone soldier. Now, why did I think it was actually important enough to sit down with Harriet Levin of all people? I mean, after all, sadly, there have been many lone soldiers in the IDF who've been killed. Why am I talking with Harriet Levin? Why did I have that conversation? It's really important for you to know that until Michael Levin was killed in that summer of 2006, most Israelis had no idea what lone soldiers were, or why we came, or what the hell we were doing here. The story goes, and I don't want to ruin it because it's a beautiful story, and Harriet is going to share the story next week. But the bottom line is that when Michael was buried on Har Herzl, Mount Herzl, in the military cemetery in Jerusalem, she was afraid that she wouldn't have a minyan because she didn't have family in Israel. And so she asked a few friends in Israel to put out the word, get 9 people, please, to show up at the funeral. And when she showed up at Michael's funeral, there were thousands of people, thousands of Israelis who showed up not knowing who this kid was, but because that's the Israeli thing to do. And he really opened the eyes of the Israeli public to who lone soldiers are. I think it's fair to say that without Michael Levin and without his having fallen in Lebanon 19 years ago, we wouldn't have this strong lone soldier movement we have right now, including 3,500 lone soldiers coming from overseas to serve. So the main takeaway from this episode, which sets up the interview next week, is that it's because of Michael that there are so many lone soldiers, and it's because of Michael that they get the services that they do. I can tell you firsthand, when I was in the IDF, I was a lone soldier. I got a little, it's like a business card that said my name and my Army ID number, and that I was a lone soldier, and I carried that around with me. And when I needed help, I would show it to my commanders. I would say, I need to go home early this week. Instead of Friday morning, I need to go home Thursday afternoon so that I can meet my landlord and negotiate a new rental contract, or pay the rent, or pay a phone bill, or do my laundry. And they would look at this little card that said lone soldier, and they would think I was faking it. They had no idea what lone soldiers were. And sometimes they wouldn't give me the rights that I was entitled to just because they didn't know about this phenomenon of lone soldiers. And that changed because of Michael. Now, there is a downside to Michael's popularity as well. I just call it the Michael Levin phenomenon. And this is where, well, let's back up a second. I've always felt that there are two kinds of lone soldiers. There are those who are raised with a very strong Jewish background, maybe day school and summer camp, pretty fluent in Hebrew, or if not fluent, their Hebrew is very strong. And so they moved to Israel and joined the Israeli army because it's really the next natural step in their Jewish identity. And I would put myself in that category, and I would put Michael in that category. But then there is another category of lone soldier, and I call them the lost souls. These are the ones who are a little bit lost in their lives, and they think that being a lone soldier will finally give them an identity and will make them a hero and will save them. And they struggle in the army. And there was an expose done by Haaretz newspaper probably about 8 years ago now, maybe 7 years ago, where they showed that the suicide rate among lone soldiers was significantly higher than it was among other soldiers in the IDF. sadly, we had a lone soldier take his own life about 2 weeks ago. I believe he was from Holland, though I'm not 100% sure about that. But in any case, this second category of lone soldiers, they come over, I think, for the wrong reasons. They come over not really knowing what they're getting themselves into. They don't necessarily have other family who served in the army before them. I had a ton of Israeli friends. I had a girlfriend who'd served in the IDF. I had a lot of support while I was here. And Michael did too, being part of the Nativ program beforehand and spending that year here. But a lot of these lost souls that I'm talking about really don't have that support system, and they really struggle. And the army, as this article in Haaretz pointed out, the army has not done a good job of screening them. The army has not interviewed them and really dug deep in these interviews to make sure that they are here for the right reason and that they're not going to be a liability to their platoon or to themselves. And I think there's a reason for this. I think the army loves the idea of the lone soldier. I mean, what could be more Israeli than a young man or a young woman throwing on a backpack and flying on El Al to the promised land and joining up in the IDF? That's like the epitome of the pioneer movement, right? That is the modern pioneer action, to come and serve in the IDF as a lone soldier. And the army loves this idea that lone soldiers come and join the best combat units, because we have a really high rate of joining the best combat units because we're so motivated. But at the same time, the army, because they're so in love with this idea of the lone soldier, they haven't really tried to screen them enough. They haven't looked for the red flags that come up in their interviews and in their questionnaires. And so we have had a higher than normal rate of suicide among lone soldiers. So I think it's important for you to know that side of the story as well. It's not completely rosy. Now, what I've heard is that the Army, since that article came out, has responded and has tried to take more steps to screen to make sure lone soldiers are actually a correct fit. But I can tell you, like I said, a couple of weeks ago, we had a suicide of a lone soldier here, and there have been others. And I do think the Army needs to do a better job. I sometimes speak to groups of lone soldiers before they go in, and I can tell you, I can tell you immediately which ones are going to have a normal service, difficult, but normal, and which ones are really going to struggle. I can just tell from speaking to them for 2 minutes about why they came and what their connection to Israel is. So that is an aspect of the lone soldier phenomenon as well. The most important takeaway, though, that you need to come out of from this episode for next week is that until there was Michael Levin, Israelis did not know what lone soldiers were. And it was because of Michael that everything changed. I'll be back in about a minute with your questions before we wrap up. Welcome back to the final segment of this week's episode of Inside Israel, episode 95, Lone Soldier Need to Know. Our first question is from Michelle. And both questions today sort of relate to everything going on right now, the strike, the protests, this feeling that the government really is turning its back on the will of the Israeli people. So Michelle writes, I wonder how Bibi's decision-making processes might be impacted if one or both of his own sons were being held hostage. And yeah, a lot of people are saying that Bibi is basically making decisions about the fate of the hostages, while his own son, Yair, who is quite a troublemaker, and troublemaker is a very you a light word. I could go a lot further, but his own son Yair is living in Miami. I believe it's millions of shekels a year it's costing the Israeli taxpayer to provide security for Yair. He goes to nightclubs, parties. He tweets a lot against members of the Israeli government. He tweets against the chief of staff. He says disparaging things on Twitter, on X, against the former chief of staff, against members of the government. Um, really just horrific things. He did not serve in the army himself. So, this whole idea of giving to the country is something that Bibi's own son did not do. And many are saying, if it were your son, you would feel differently. But meanwhile, your son is off partying in Miami while our sons and daughters are in Gaza and fighting and losing our lives and being injured permanently. So there's a lot of that sentiment as well, that's fueling the frustration and the anger of the Israeli public. Is just that Bibi is making choices for hostages and soldiers when his own family conveniently has been able to escape both of those fates. This second question, it's less of a question, but it's more of a statement, and I'm going to keep it anonymous for reasons you'll understand why in a second. I have a lot of family in Israel, and many of them hate American Jews. And I'm not just stam, meaning I'm not just simply saying this. Their position is that Americans have no zechut, no right to speak because they don't pay taxes to Israel. They don't go to the IDF, don't send their kids to the IDF. They don't try to make a career in Israel. So their opinions shouldn't matter. Now, I do want to respond to this. I can't say that this is the majority opinion amongst Israelis, but there are a fair number of Israelis who feel this way. That especially now, when they see American Jews protesting, when they see certain Jewish charities contributing money to feed Gazans. And look, nobody likes to see hungry, starving, innocent people. But when that money could go to help rehabilitate Israeli communities or injured Israeli soldiers, I think it triggers something in Israelis of until you live here and until you really pay the price of living here, there is a cover charge for living in Israel. And until you pay that cover charge, your opinion shouldn't matter as much. So I wanted to share that comment with you because although it's maybe not the majority opinion, it certainly does reflect how some Israelis feel, especially right now. Next week, that is August 20th. Sorry, next week is August 24th, next Sunday. There is going to be no live episode. I am going to be traveling. I'm doing a show in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So if you're nearby, coming out to the Jewish Federation kickoff campaign brunch, nothing like comedy at 10:30 in the morning. But that's what's going to be happening next Sunday morning in Chattanooga, Tennessee for the Jewish Federation. If you're around, please show up. Drop me a line. I'll see you there. But in any case, because I'm on the road, there will not be a live episode next week. However, if you tune in to Apple or Spotify on Wednesday, the 27th of August, you can hear my conversation with Harriet Levin. If you are not subscribed to the podcast on Apple or Spotify, I encourage you to do that now so you can hear this amazing conversation we had. The link is on my own website, joelchasnoff.com/podcast. Thank you so much to everyone who joined this week. I look forward to seeing you again live in 2 weeks for the live broadcast. Until then, Rak Smachot and Lehitraot. I'm Joel from Ra'anana, signing off.